What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to another episode of AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. I'm Larry Rifkin, and John Krofsick, thankfully, still by my side. You haven't left me yet.
Hey, how are you today?
I'm good.
I'm here. We're ready to go.
You must not have any other place to go, huh?
Well, after that travel series, I'm all traveled out.
I'll tell you, the travel series, if you haven't listened to it, it's there for you to listen to. We are so proud of it. And we are so grateful to all the incredible travel writers who participated. And we're not afraid to do series. And if you'd like some series, just write to me and let me know that. Or John, you can just get to us on our Facebook page at Trends Podcast or on Twitter at Trends Podcast. We'd love to know what you'd like to know more about. What are you curious about in terms of trends going forward? And if your curiosity doesn't kill you and matches ours, then who knows?
Yeah, it would be great.
Could we do a dedication if somebody gives us a series idea?
Oh, that would be an interesting idea.
This one's dedicated. It's almost like Cousin Brucey. You know, Cousin Brucey, the other night I was coming back from Boston, and we were listening to, can I say this? Sirius XM.
Oh, that's serious stuff.
And there he was. Lo and behold, it wasn't 1963. It wasn't 1973. It wasn't 1983. It's 2017, and he's still at Palisades Park.
Hey, you know, we can do long-distance dedications.
No, but there's Cousin Brucey. Hey, my cousins, how you doing? Irina, a cousin, where are you coming from? From Nebraska. I love you, Cousin Brucey. I mean, honest to God, and he's 82 years old.
It's amazing.
I mean, really, and he sounds exactly like he did in the past.
He sounds like Cousin Brucey.
My goodness. Well, at any rate, you know, the issues have changed a little bit since 1963, because don't forget, in 1963, when WABC in New York was the hottest thing in radio, we didn't even have something like Medicare. Medicare wasn't there. We hadn't developed it yet, or Medicaid. So those things weren't even on our radar. And here we are in 2017, John, and we're going to throw a concept out there that I don't think a lot of people have heard much about. And that's why, because we're always looking at what the future may hold. And that's why we've got to have a long lens here on America Trends.
That's right.
And I've been reading about Universal Basic Income, UBI. Now, this is not like an intestinal disorder. I know it sounds a little bit like that. It's not. And it's not a bank that has a big facility in Stamford, Connecticut, UBS, or RBS, the Royal Bank of Scotland. No, it's UBI.
UBI.
Now, have you ever heard of this?
I have not. UBI.
UBI.
No.
Or you be me, and I be you. Well, what UBI is an idea that because there's so much dislocation in our economies these days, that maybe the best thing we can do so that we can perhaps make simpler some of the anti-poverty programs and some of the subsistence programs is to just give everybody a baseline of income. And if they want to work above that, if they want to do something else with their lives, they can. But they know at the very minimum that they're going to be able to have this universal basic income. Now, this isn't something that's been adopted in many places, but I know in Denmark, in Finland, and even to some extent, I guess if you wanted to look at some kind of analog to this in the United States, it's not in the continental United States, but if you looked at Alaska, everybody in Alaska, because of the oil receipts, gets some money from the government.
Yep.
Yeah, they get a check.
That's true.
Yeah. So anyway, the idea is certain people want to scrap all of the overlapping programs, welfare and other things that are related to your income. and just give you a baseline. Others say, let's do it only for the poor. And yet there are many questions about this, many drawbacks. Is it going to keep people from wanting to work?
Well, that's my concern is anytime you give free stuff, doesn't it take away the need to really go out and have to do something with yourself? I mean, that would be my fear.
I think for some it would. But, John, I don't think, look, you've worked all your life. I've worked all my life. If somebody said that to me, I'd say, okay, that's good. I'll put it aside, and I'll keep moving. Because if you gave me $30,000 a year, I don't want to live on $30,000 a year. So I would say I'm going to move on from this point. Now, there are many people who might not. But then again, this is really meant to say there's so much dislocation and disruption that pretty soon people may not have enough work to do.
But haven't most of the programs that we put in place actually did this when we put welfare and all? I mean, basically that's paid people to stay home. And now you've got generations of people who have stayed home, and maybe there's some brilliant people, but they just don't have the ambition to move on because they don't know how to work.
Well, I think in 1996, the whole idea of welfare reform was to encourage people that if you really need a hand up for a period of time, here it is. And if you need help in getting daycare or transportation, but we really want you in the workforce, that's the better place to be. And, of course, I know we've seen a lot of changes in our disability program. And, of course, we have done the series, Men Out of Work.
Right.
And we've seen too many young men sitting on the sidelines, on the couch, playing video games and not getting launched, if you will. So maybe this is not something we will ever see. But then again, we have to note that Mark Zuckerberg, who ended up in Iowa recently at one of these bus stops or truck stops, and he was like, hey, real people live here. That's really interesting.
He's such a virtual guy.
Yeah, right. Hey, man, you fill up your tank. What else do you like to do? So there's Mark Zuckerberg, because some people are saying that he's thinking of running for president. Can you imagine this?
Wow.
Well, look at the power of Facebook.
I know. You're right. It's kind of scary.
Well, he's thinking of that. And to say that he is thinking about it is to say that he's going to start launching some ideas out there. And he went and he spoke at Harvard, where he never graduated, where he dropped out.
Right.
At the commencement, he said, I think we should adopt universal basic income. So he got a lot of people chattering about this, including Mark Hendrickson. Now, Mark Hendrickson is more of a conservative thinker, and I read an op-ed that he did, and I thought it'd be great to have him on America Trends podcast to tell us what he thinks about universal basic income, and we could talk about it. And by the way, there are some conservative thinkers who have adopted this idea way back. Milton Friedman, who is the godfather of conservative economics, thought that this might be a necessary thing down the road. And so did Charles Murray, who we've had on our radio program.
See, now, I think our other program, National Service, is something we should be looking at first.
Well, remind people of that, because that's still posted.
Well, and I think that's one to look back on, because everybody should serve 2 years, whether it's military, whether it's to your community. I think that's a fantastic idea, and I think before we did anything like this, I think we would have to give something like that a try, to give people an opportunity to work and to see what it's like.
And in that way,
workplace.
the government is giving them some income for a period of time,
Right.
but they're also giving back to the society. So
Exactly.
Interesting idea. Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we listen to Mark Hendrickson?
Let's do that, because I'm very curious about this.
And by the way, there is a prescription if you do get UBI at any point
What is
in
that?
your lifetime.
How much is it?
Oh, there's no generic for this. Let's go to Mark Hendrickson.
Well, when you look at it, there are so many people, particularly in Silicon Valley, who believe that there's a wonderful new idea there to help people as they look at the financial uncertainties of our times. And let me just quote. There's a gentleman by the name, of course, of Elon Musk. He is with Tesla. He's the CEO, a very forward-looking guy. He said there will be fewer and fewer jobs that a robot cannot do better. I think some kind of universal basic income is going to be necessary. And then, of course, I read where Jack Ma feels that people will be working on average in several years about 4 hours a day at best. And then this is what got a lot of attention recently. At Harvard's commencement last month, the dropout, Mark Zuckerberg, told eager graduates to create a new social contract for their generation. And let me just quote him. He said, "We should have a society that measures progress not just by measurements economic like GDP, but by how many of us have a role we find meaningful." And then he said, "We should explore ideas like universal basic income to give everyone a cushion to try new things." And I read a piece, an op-ed in our local daily newspaper by Mark Hendrickson. He's an adjunct faculty member, economist, and fellow for the Economic and Social Policy at the Center for Vision and Values at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. And Mark, this idea, and you were certainly, focused on what it was that Mark Zuckerberg had to say, universal basic income. For people who have never heard this concept before, what does it really mean?
Well, essentially, Larry, it's an allowance, or it's a stipend, where once a month there would be a stipulated amount that would be sent from the federal government to every adult in the United States of America, regardless of occupation, regardless of income or whatever. It's designed, I guess, to be sort of just a basic maintenance, something to pay the basic expenses of life so that, as Mark Zuckerberg said to the graduating class at Harvard, some of you guys probably have some ideas and you just need some time to sort of sit around and figure out how to get a business started. So here, we'll have an allowance from the government and you can do your thing.
So if I then went from the basement and heavy thunk in the basement and somehow I built something like Mark Zuckerberg built, like Facebook, and I became a billionaire many times over, would I still be getting this?
Yeah, but there are so few billionaires. I mean, you're talking less than a rounding error in Washington money. And it's a little bit of the government gives and the government takes, because obviously somebody has to pay for this, and it's going to have to be the people who generate a higher income, through their labor, their investments, et cetera. So, it's like you would get it, but you wouldn't really need it, and you would be actually paying taxes to the government, not only to fund your own, but to fund the allowance that would go out to other Americans who perhaps aren't working or earning much of an income.
Now, is this based on a need that we see because of the changing dynamics with work, automation, technology? Is this really the impetus for this idea?
I think it's one of them. I mean, that's a wonderful question, and it gets into a whole lot of different issues. Certainly, the job market is changing. In economics, we basically, though, have this notion that human wants are never completely satisfied. And as technology has developed and brought new wonders to light in our lives, we partake of those. And then we get restless, though, and we look for the next thing. So, robots are going to take over some jobs, just as mechanization has been taking over jobs for the last few centuries, just as the major example being agriculture. When the United States was just getting started in the late 1700s, 85% of Americans were farmers. Well, due to mechanization and improved technology, the productivity of agriculture went way up, and now we're producing more food than we could possibly eat with just 1.5% of our population farming, which means that most people are free to produce other goods and services that add to our wealth in life. So, I mean, mechanization isn't bad. I don't think any of us wants to go back to the Stone Age or just living hand to mouth or anything like that. So, to me, this is a little bit of a red herring. There's going to be a need for entrepreneurs to find new value-creating enterprises, and they'll need labor to do that. And so then that gets into the whole issue of just reducing the taxes and regulations that keep many businesses from getting started.
Now, would this basic income, subsistence, in some sense, would it take the place of all the other government programs that are now there in place for people who really need that safety net? And I know you point in your op-ed to the fact that there were two notable proponents that were conservative thinkers. One, the late Milton Friedman, and the other, of course, Charles Murray from the American Enterprise Institute. So are there different approaches to this universal basic income, some that displace and others that supplement?
Yes, exactly. And I can't give you a catalog of what they are, but certainly Charles Murray has written about this recently. He has a book called In Our Hands. Now, he didn't convince me of the overall validity of this concept of providing a guaranteed income for everybody, but at least he has the sense of fiscal responsibility to say, hey, let's make this the lesser of two evils, because our current welfare state and federal management of retirement through Social Security, federal involvement in the medical business through Medicare, Medicaid, he said, wasteful bureaucracies, he said there's got to be a better way of doing this. And so Murray's plan would be to literally just wipe the deck clean and remove all those other programs, and there are dozens and dozens of them. In fact, if you look at the website for the catalog for federal domestic assistance, there are over 2,000 federal programs that provide assistance to Americans. And he would like to just replace it with this one simple concept. So there might be some savings there. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg at Harvard, he didn't specify. He said, well, we need to look into this. But if we tried to add a UBI, a universal basic income, to all the other programs that we have, I mean, we're already $20 trillion in debt as a country. We're not managing to balance the budget now. If you keep everything that we're spending now and add that, I'd say basically it's undoable. I mean, it won't add up.
Well, a more recent podcast that we did with Lawrence Kotlikoff says our fiscal gap is closer to $200 trillion. But at this point, I guess you just stop counting and you just start praying. I must ask you, as we do look at it, has this been tried anywhere else? Because here in America, we're one of the few countries that really doesn't look at health care as a universal right. We're still struggling with that. Why would we even be among the first to adopt something like this if it ever took place?
Well, that's another great question. And I think part of it is simply political. I mean, Santa Claus is coming to town. Everybody likes Santa Claus. Zuckerberg's speech at Harvard had a little bit of the campaign feel to it. It was like, just make everybody feel good. Hey, we care about you. We're going to do this, that, the other thing. And so it's like, hey, freebies,
But what was Mark Zuckerberg campaigning for? Do you think he has political office in mind?
Yeah, I've read accounts about that, but I don't know. I don't know the man. I don't. Some people are convinced that's the case. It could be just a general reflection of the circle, the social circle, the intellectual circle that he hangs out in. But, these ideas are very popular right now. I mean, Bernie Sanders, who's a self-avowed socialist, almost won the Democratic nomination for president, and he was gaining a lot of popularity by going to colleges and say, hey, guys, I think college should be free. Well, hey, if you're a college student struggling over paying bills, that sounds really attractive.
Well, when you look across the pond and you see some of the people who are being elected at the hands of a lot of young people coming out, particularly in Britain recently with Jeremy Corbyn, there is this movement toward a more progressive effort that young people seem to really be picking up on. So do you see the universal basic income as one of those things that perhaps some of these more liberal and socialist-leaning governments in Europe might adopt?
Yeah, in fact, you mentioned earlier, alluded to the fact that maybe it's being tried somewhere else. There's an experimental program being set up in Finland right now for something like this, on just a portion of their population. They want to test it on, X number of thousands rather than the whole country. And a similar program is being launched in Canada. So, yeah, the whole progressive idea is that the government should be more actively involved in trying to improve the standards of living of citizens, and it becomes very politically popular. It's very seductive for voters to have somebody say, hey, I really care about you, so let me give this to you. And, well, that's great, but then the hard economic question is, where are you getting the means or the money to give this to other people?
What about the notion that if this were coupled, you take away some of the wasteful, duplicative programs that we now have, you give people subsistence, and I read where Denmark now is doing this only for the poorest, where citizens who are very poor are getting $1,800 a month, but you couple that with an incentive for character building and discipline with some form of workfare. What do you think? Does that in any way make it more palatable?
It sounds more palatable, but I question whether you even need to get a government involved to teach people to be more responsible or whatever. There can be community efforts to this. Our country has a rich history of private community groups and churches and private charities, et cetera, that have reached out to help people. The problem when you make something a federal entitlement is there's very little discrimination in hopefully a positive sense in terms of figuring out who really needs it. You don't really sift those who are in dire need from those who are just out to get a free lunch if they can. I think bringing the federal government into it makes no sense. I'll give you an example. Zuckerberg, okay? He says to the Harvard grads, hey, some of you are going to have a hard time, despite your degree, getting a job, and wouldn't it be great if we had a universal basic income so you could sit home and think about it for a year and launch a great business? Well, I think that it would be wonderful if a lot of these talented graduates launched new businesses, and they'd put Americans to work, and they'd create new goods and services. That's a wonderful idea. But here you've got a citizen who himself has access to tens of billions of dollars. Why doesn't he use some of that money to start a foundation or a company or something like that that would interview people? They could apply. They say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing. I need 10 months to kind of work it out. Can you help me out? And they could give grants to the people who they think are really serious about doing this. So it's like, I applaud his notion of, wouldn't it be great if we can lend a hand to some young entrepreneurs in that? But why do you have to get the federal government involved when it's already broke? Why not just do it yourself?
What level of dampening do you think would take place if people really felt that they had this basics covered and that they could kind of play a little bit more in their life and not necessarily face the consequence that they're not going to have a roof over their head or food on the table? It would not be necessarily a glamorous life or one that we all read about and see about often on television, but it would be basic. What would that do to the incentives that generally our society, a capitalist society, have put in front of people, that if they work hard, this is what they can expect to see as a reward?
Yeah, I think it could act as a honey trap for some people. If you asked me to quantify it or say what percentage of people would be adversely affected, I couldn't begin to give you an honest answer there, Larry. It would be a total guess off the top of my head. But I'm familiar enough with human nature to know that if you make it easy for people not to work, there will be a certain number of people, and I think a fairly large number of human beings, who would just kind of get caught up in that. One of our big problems now, Nick Eberstadt, who's a demographer at the American Enterprise Institute.
Yes, he's been a guest with us. Yes.
Okay, well, he might have mentioned the army of the 10 million men in America who are of healthy, prime working age, in their 30s and stuff, who basically have dropped out. They live with girlfriends, they live with mom and dad, they get together some buddies in an apartment and scrounge a little money here and then work the welfare system, whatever. But they just they don't do anything. They vegetate. They're not trying to educate themselves. They're not trying to acquire skills. They don't even go to the gym and work out. They're just sitting around. And I'm not sure that that's a really kind thing for us to contemplate doing for large numbers of people, making it possible for them. Sure, they won't starve. That's great. But there's more to life, I think, potentially, than just not starving. Most of us find meaning from doing something positive. So, we have. I'm thinking of writing a book called The Challenge of Affluence. It's a very difficult thing for us to, because it sure beats poverty, but there's also some side effects, and people just after a while, they start to think that life is meant to be easy. And it's like, I'm not trying to say it should be full of suffering or harsh or anything like that, but I think human beings, psychologically, spiritually, however you want to look at it, I think we need challenge. And I think most of us who have worked hard for decades and accomplished something in our careers, I think we get a satisfaction from that accomplishment that you can't put it in dollar terms, but you know that if somebody had just given you an allowance, and we see this with some trust fund babies. I mean, bless their hearts, their rich parents want to take care of their kids, and some of them can handle the trust fund and live productive lives, and others end up leading.
Yeah, many of us have seen a second generation of entrepreneurs, and it's a spotty record indeed. Let me ask you, you say in your op-ed piece, and we're talking to Mark Hendrickson about this issue of a universal basic income, that it would be the most unrepealable entitlement ever. Explain that.
Sure. Right now, as I said before, we have dozens and dozens of different federal programs. You know, this program gives money to these, 1.5 million people. This program helps these 450,000 people. But a universal basic income would go to all Americans. And so, try to get a repeal of something that all Americans are getting for free, Now, you could get the rich who are paying for it, or you could get the minority of people at the top. You could say, yeah, I don't need it, so give it up. But if you've got more people on the receiving end than you do on the paying end of things, you've gone past a tipping point. And I just think that you not only would you not repeal it, but you'd probably run into a situation where you've got 75% of the people saying, hey, you know what, $1,000 a month isn't quite enough. Let's ask our representatives in Congress to make it raise it to $1,200, raise it to $1,400. Let's eventually get it up to $2,000 a month. Oh, why stop there? Let's make it $5,000. It's a slippery slope, and it's like, where do you stop? And if you've got the majority on your side, I mean, this is what happened in ancient Rome. It had more people on the receiving end, and they would keep voting for senators who would give them freebies. And meanwhile, the productive sector kept shrinking and shrinking. They'd move away. They'd get out of Dodge so they could escape the taxation. You just can't do that to a society where you're saying to people, hey, there's nothing you have to do except cash your check. It's not a healthy way to live.
How do you look at Milton Friedman? Of course, he talked about this universal basic income, but he also was a big proponent, of course, of the earned income credit. And that's for working individuals who are still finding it very, very difficult. Do you like that program? A lot of Republicans do. There are some who don't. What do you think about the earned income tax credit? Is that an alternative?
Wow. I'm not sure I have an answer to that, Larry, because I haven't thought about it to any extent at all. I certainly understand the two sides of the argument. I mean, I would think that the Republicans who are in favor of it say, hey, look, it's better to have people working and getting on the bottom rungs of the economic ladder of progress, at least get them into the workplace. And there's a lot to be said for that, because I think idleness can be very destructive to the human spirit and to our society. So I think that's what lies behind it. But I can't help but feel, though, that it's something like of a compromise. It's like, why does the federal government have to get that involved in our lives? And of course, there I've betrayed my own orientation. I'm not a progressive. I mean, I believe in. I think progressivism is the best label ever adopted in American politics, because what American is not in favor of progress? But
so as a slogan, you like it, but not as a working philosophy.
But if it means progressively large government. The problem with it is this. Again, I mentioned the term slippery slope, and it is, because if you help A and B, well, why don't you have the government then help C and D? And if you're helping these people with their housing, why don't you help them with their transportation? Why don't you help them with their college education? Why don't you help them with their daycare? I mean, so you always have government proposing more things. There's always more things that can be done to uplift somebody's standard of living. So there's really no end to it. And once the basic concept is accepted, and I think, I mean, I could even tie this into the shooting last week of Congressman Scalise and the others. I think what we're divided by in our country is that it's right down that basic ideological divide of the people who believe that it's the government's role to redistribute wealth in order to allegedly help certain people, and those who say, no, it's the government's job to keep us free so that we can find clever ways of producing wealth and out of compassion help our fellow man, but to do it on a voluntary basis. And it's like, they're not evil people on one side or the other. It's just it's an idea that it's irreconcilable. The two positions are irreconcilable.
But Mark, at this point in our society, there are many things that we are subsidizing. As you said, there was that quote of thousands of anti-poverty related programs. If somebody said, well, this is going to be just more efficient, we're not going to have all of these different programs competing for dollars, we're just going to have this one basic program. If we assume that we're still going to have some college involvement by the federal government in terms of loans, if we assume that daycare and transportation, which were part of welfare reform, are still going to be somewhere in the mix, would it be better to think about a more efficient way to distribute dollars rather than all of these individualized programs?
That is the attractive part from the conservative libertarian standpoint. I liken this support of the universal basic income by conservatives and libertarians to those who say, well, let's legalize drugs. Not that these drugs are good, not that one necessarily favors their use, but that maybe it will be less costly to society. Maybe in spite of the fact of the havoc that drugs can wreak in a person's life, if they're legalized, perhaps there will be a net reduction of havoc in society because you won't have, the gangs and the warfare and the quality control issues, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know the answer to that. And it's the same thing here. It's like, well, certainly, a true conservative or libertarian would say, well, no, the government shouldn't be involved. But if we concede that that is an unattainable goal and that the government's going to be involved, then let's find a way to minimize the damage. Let's try to at least save a few $100 billion a year through greater efficiencies, through a simple program like a universal basic income. And that is the Charles Murray, Milton Friedman advocacy of these programs. Not that this is what you would design from scratch if you wanted to build a great society, but given the current mess of welfare programs, bureaucracies, inefficiencies, corruptions, et cetera, maybe we'd have a less bad situation by just having this one simple universal guarantee of income.
Well, it's interesting that you tied the legalization issue to what we're discussing, because today in the Wall Street Journal, Andy Kessler wrote, universal basic income combined with legal weed could ruin an entire generation. We'll never get them out of their collective basements. Thanks, Zuck. How do you react to that?
Well, again, I think many people would fall into that trap that Andy Kessler has set forth. Would everybody? Probably not. But it's like, and this is where having evolved from a socialist as a young guy to more conservative and definitely free market now, I just don't know that I'm comfortable with using society as a guinea pig. We're talking about a massive experiment here. It's like on paper, maybe this makes sense. In practice, as Andy Kessler says, in practice, this could be lethal. This could just ruin a lot of lives. So, I don't think everybody's going to agree on the extent to which whether a UBI would be the lesser of two evils, and B, if you had it, would it how many people would it hurt?
Yeah.
I don't really want to find out.
I understand. Let me ask you, Philip Kotler, he is the S.C. Johnson Distinguished Professor of International Marketing at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. And he wrote, why is it that in a rich country like the U.S., poverty continues to affect 50 million citizens, about 15% of our citizens? At the other end, the top 0.1% of our citizens receive 40% of all income and own 40% of all of our wealth. Numerous studies show that our income distribution, instead of getting more equitable, is growing more inequitable over time. If the universal basic income is not a remedy for that, what can we do?
Wow. We're going to solve the world's problems here, Larry. it's interesting. I've studied the inequality issue a little bit. I got some census data. Actually, the top 5% get 23% of the income, not the top 1% getting 40%. But anyhow, maybe he's talking about capital gains income or something like that. First of all, you have to look at poverty and decide whether you're speaking of it in absolute terms or relative terms. I mean, being poor in America is like having a lifestyle that's better than, in terms of living space and amenities, it's better than being a middle-class Japanese, a middle-class German, or a middle-class British person. Statistically, there's always going to be a bottom 15%, unless you have a Castro-type socialism where everybody's just leveled in poverty or something. So there's always going to be a bottom 15%. But at the same time, I think this is where I think this whole idea of reducing regulations. There's a party out there, political party I'm talking about, that speaks a lot about jobs, and then every time they open their mouth, they're bashing business, and it's like, well, if you want jobs, you better have some businesses to hire them. There's a great misunderstanding of poverty and wealth in this country too. The wealthy are wealthy in America, not like the wealthy strata of society was back in the Middle Ages, when it was because of political power. The kings and the nobles owned all the lands and the valuable wealth-producing assets. The only way in a free market that one can get wealthy is by providing goods and services to others. If somebody's got $1 billion that they've earned honestly in the marketplace, they have provided more than $1 billion worth of value to the lifestyles of their fellow citizens.
But there does seem to be greater stratification than in the past, where those who have grown up with that type of wealth or a certain amount of wealth really are going to stay more in their positions of privilege than those who are trying to bust through from one lower middle class environment into the middle class. It just seems that movement up the ladder isn't quite as easy as it once was.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think, again, the welfare state is some of the blame. Some of these people learn at an early age to rely on these government programs, and it blunts their initiative to get out there. I started off as a high school teacher, and I substituted in the inner cities of one of our large urban areas, and I'll tell you, a good day in those schools was when nobody got hurt, but I really grieved for the young students there because they weren't getting an education, which is what is absolutely necessary in our technological society. Like it or not, we talked about the robots earlier. Grunt physical labor is not going to be in demand. We're going to have people learn more how to do mental processes, so mental kind of, or low-skilled work in personal services or something like that. So again, though, the education is so important. That's why I'm a real strong advocate of school choice, introducing the economic element of competition to improve education, because I have seen in inner cities kids basically having their whole future life prospects dashed at an early age because of a lousy education. So, there are reforms we can make. I'm not concerned about the rich getting richer. What I'd like to see is more people climbing out of poverty, and I just think that there's such a molasses of kind of just different programs and different blocked off opportunities. I don't think it's going to be solved by the government having more programs. I think it's going to be solved by Americans being free to find the solutions. And so I'd say do away with the government.
Well, let me give you one more quote, because you talked about the fact that menial jobs and menial work will go away. Would this make you think any differently about universal basic income? Let me quote, and then I'll tell you who said this. We will get to a point, all of our societies, where technology is displacing so many jobs, not just menial jobs, but also professional jobs, that we're going to have to take seriously the notion of universal basic income. Now, that was the former Labor Secretary, Robert Reich. Now, he is obviously to the left. Do you see professional work actually being threatened in this age of technology?
Yes, I think that it's marvelous and a little scary. It's going to be very unsettling. Change is always unsettling, but it's going to be in the white-collar areas as well as in the blue-collar, the mental and the physical. But again, I just come back to that basic elemental truth that humans are never satisfied. So it's like outsourcing of jobs. It's like, people say, oh, well, a job, the American multinational has outsourced X number of jobs to this country over there. And yet the studies show that the companies that do the outsourcing and increase hiring of foreigners also increase the hiring of domestic workers, because what they're able to do then is to focus on their areas of greatest value added and their core competencies and so on and so forth. So I think it's the same thing with machines. I mean, it's like, sure, have the machines do something that that a person does now, like accounting, for example. I mean, sorry for all the accountants in your audience, but maybe machines and computers can do it faster and quicker. It means
but they don't have the personality that most accountants have. Well, listen, Mark, I have to wrap this up, but I want to thank you so much for engaging with us about this really interesting topic that many people are not aware of. I don't think there's a formal proposal out there. I don't think anybody even in Congress has put anything forward, but it is beginning to get a lot of chatter, and Mark Zuckerberg and his commencement address at Harvard certainly brought it to the fore. And I thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends Podcast.
Well, thanks so much.
If you like this episode, please leave us a kind rating or review. I'm on my hands and knees. Please do it on iTunes, because your review is really critical for us to continue providing this podcast. And John, I know that iTunes looks at this. They want to make certain that we have some rankings, some visibility, and that we're getting some traffic, and then they give you better positioning.
Absolutely. And this way it'll put us in the forefront so you can find us much easier on your iPhone or Android, whatever you may be using.
And they may even send you out an alert. So please, if you can, don't miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. And, John, they can subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com.
And also subscribe on our website.
Oh, absolutely.
We send out a little blurb, and we can also take your emails there at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. That's another way to get us.
And we do not sell or share our lists.
Nothing.
Well, I don't know. Does anybody want our lists? I don't know, but we don't do it.
Good question.
Even if they asked us.
Nobody's
asked us. But.
Right.
And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. We're getting very active on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms, and John, this is really easy, @Trends Podcast. That's it.
That's real easy.
You like that? Did you get that?
I got that.
Okay.
I'm going to have to check it out now. I'm going to have to twit it.
We want to thank you, of course, personally for subscribing. And we also would like to get some of your ideas and questions for future episodes of America Trends Podcast. And that's important, too, because we're all over the map. Our interest editorially in the future, John, has no bounds. But we want to know what it is that you'd like to hear from us. If there was a segment that you'd like to see us follow up on, or if there's something in depth that you'd like us to deal with, please let us know that, too.
We're looking at the future. There's so much we can look at.
Yeah, and the topics that we've dealt with, I mean, we have gotten such incredible guests over the recent period, but they're only going to come to us if they know we've got an engaged and interactive audience.
Absolutely.
So it's really important that you become part of this podcast in so many different ways that we're sharing with you today.
You're absolutely right. We need your support and your help and your reviews.
And your ideas.
And ideas.
Or questions on Facebook and Twitter. And by the way, you can direct message us @Trends Podcast or using the hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have a public one that you'd like us to give out.
Yeah, good. And you know what? We didn't mention Amazon.
Oh, yes. We have an Amazon store.
Yes.
And so if you go up, you don't have to buy the things that might be highlighted at that particular time. You can buy any book, and there's some benefit that comes back to us.
Just put what you're looking at in the little search engine block there, and it'll take you right to Amazon, and it'll help us out.
Absolutely. And it doesn't really cost you anything more because they have built that into their pricing structure. So we get a little taste, and you get more programming like this, and you get the item that you were looking for. So it works for all of us.
It's a win-win.
Absolutely. Win-win-win.
Win-win-win.
So for more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. And again, you can find John and I here in our studio performing as best we can for you.
That's right.
And
Let us
making
out.
certain- What's that? They're not going to let us out. No one is. Hey, listen, thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends. We'll see you next time.
We hope to hear from you soon.
Oh, by the way, we are posting all the time, and we're posting on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Good point.
So just be aware, if you're looking for new episodes, they're coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When you wake up, before you go out on your jog or your walk and you want to take us with you, we'll be there for you.
Very good.
All right. Have a great day.